Is 11:15, everyone. Welcome to Augmenting Equity Outcomes with Creative Engagement Techniques in the Remote Environment. Hope everyone is enjoying the symposium today. It is a beautiful day outside. It's a beautiful day to be learning and being together. So we're thrilled that you decided to join us today and be in our presentation. Hopefully we'll construct a great time together on this fine Friday. So hello again and welcome. And I'd like to warm us up today with just a quick little reflective question about our time. What are you doing that might be just a little too hard today, if anything, just a little too hard? A lot of what we're discussing today actually concerns the notion of positive risk-taking and our awareness about our comfort zones. So speaking of that, I'd like to share how some of this presentation was actually conceived. It was way back when we were challenged, I think about 2 years ago, we were challenged to reflect on our grade distribution data. And it was an earlier equity day. And I just remember that space and time and thinking, wow, so that data is there and we're going to be looking at it, and how kind of exciting and uncomfortable and challenging it all was, all in one swirl. So that's just a little background, and some of you may even remember those times. But our thesis statement for the presentation is as follows: leveraging passion pursuits, creativity, community, and joyful exploration to increase equity and outcomes is possible in the remote environment if we're willing to be agile, reflective, and willing to take positive practice risks. So my name is Brian Weaver, and I have been teaching for going on about 24 years now in a variety of settings, both private and public. Ranging all the way from ECE. It's hard to believe when I even say some of these things, how, the old days, all the way up to graduate school over at the University of Denver. And so I do hold multiple degrees, one of which is in curriculum and instruction, and another is in human communication studies. And I'm joined today by Professor Molly Russell, who will be our co-presenter. So Molly, maybe just a quick introduction of yourself, and then we'll move along.
Yeah, hey, I am Molly Russ. Thank you, Brian. I'm a faculty member with Brian in the same department, in the Communication and Journalism department at the Community College of Denver. I have both my bachelor's and my master's degrees in communication studies, which is the discipline I teach. And I'm currently pursuing my doctorate of education in professional learning and technology from the University of Colorado, Denver. So I am also going to provide just a quick preview of what it is that we're going to be doing today. In today's session, Brian will first frame our discussion utilizing 3 targets from the United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. He'll also identify some equity-related questions he's been grappling with and discuss some of the positive practice risks he's employed in his work. Then I'll take over for a brief moment, and I'll discuss, sort of localize our conversation and provide some data on the equity gap here in Colorado, identify some of my own equity-related questions and ways in which I've made sense of addressing the equity gap in my work. And then lastly, we'll open the floor for our wonderful attendees and participants today for general questions and conversation, and ask you to share, if you're comfortable doing so, some of your own recommendations for engaging teaching, learning in our remote environment. So Brian, we've grappled a lot this year. Why don't you get us started and tell us about some of the equity issues you've wrestled with recently?
Sure thing, Molly. And first, I would like to begin building some common foundation for our time together today using 3 selected targets, selected from 10 total within the timely United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Goal Framework for Quality Education, in hopes to help us simply renew and inspire or even ignite our sense of inclusion for and emphasis on lifelong and adult learning in the broader field of education for all. So this further provides an anchor when grappling with issues of equity, social justice, and social unrest, because the goal also serves to disrupt our economic and transactional mindset and model of tuition-based education. We're charged to somehow model our own sense of trueness and passion, even within the surrounding paradigms of our strict data, our scores, numbers, dollars, and sometimes Sisyphean tasks, often guiding human learning and development today. Now, this anchor of the UN goal and targets when grappling with issues of equity also serves to help us shift our mutual accountability about existing barriers of privilege in higher education to a more active and human rights-based approach, perhaps with a meditative mantra for the learning for learning's sake and the love of learning. Now, Molly and I have collaborated a significant amount regarding these ideas to present to you today. And in doing so, in our collaborations, I had once remarked to her that the historic World War II era subtexts and even explicit narratives about human rights, adult and lifelong learning, painted for us, really strokes of democracy, humanitarianism, emancipation, freedom, spirituality, individual ambition, and the thirst to learn and improve. And so, like Molly had said, also the UN goal and targets really let us see through a more international and global lens on what education really means and is kind of all about in our world today. So I would say in this lifetime, and for generations before and after us, giving active attention and energy to these ideas as practitioners and as students is being a mutually accountable participant in the complex web of meaning, identity, and heritage making. So as an active and mutually accountable agent here, I would like to be vulnerable in these couple of minutes and speak openly about three specific equity-related questions that I have recently grappled with in our cultural communication studies at CCD, at Community College of Denver. Questions that inform the quality, the passion, and authenticity of students' education and experiences in my classes, and to what extent they are getting what they came for and or getting what they paid for. So the first has to do with teaching definitions of what I informally call the isms to diverse groups of students, but really are isms, phobias, and a lens on oppression. Talking ableism, ageism, classism, homophobia, racism, sexism, speciesism, transphobia, and xenophobia. Now, you may notice I've just listed these in alphabetical order. In terms of making presentation, delivery, and definition of these concepts to students this semester, I grappled with the question of how much time and emphasis to afford to each within a given time constraint. Should they be treated equally in terms of time and emphasis? Should the clear presence of students most directly affected by these differentiate the treatment or delivery in any way, shape, or form, especially in terms of time and emphasis? Even though there may be, of course, a working assumption that any class contains students that are directly affected and that all students are affected in different ways. So should a specially assigned awareness day, specially assigned awareness week or month differentiate the treatment of delivering these concepts in any way and in terms of time and emphasis? Now, my second question has to do with educator fear or apprehension in triggering or contentious material these days. Should we run toward conflict in the classroom? And if so, should we standardize procedures for trigger warnings? Now, warnings for landmines may be an effective or even more effective metaphor as well. You see, I teach a popular culture course. And this semester, I was leveraging a few elements from a very popular reality television series to help provide some easy examples, benign examples, I thought, of intertextual rhetoric in popular culture. During the series, a highly contentious and racially charged controversy just exploded onto the scene, igniting already inflammatory arguments about our cancel culture these days. I grappled, lost sleep with fear and apprehension about continuing to use the series in examples, mentioning it, or maybe instead I should just be running toward the conflict in the classroom setting in an effort to leverage a teaching moment and create space for students to process the controversy in an academic setting as opposed to just on social media or some other alternative. The third question has to do with my revising existing lecture material about the correctness of language in cultures to now build from a foundation suggesting that perhaps making a claim that there is any such thing as correctness in language at all is much more a matter of subjective philosophy and perspective and less a matter of the application of any dominant or historic rules. I always think of our students who have a masterful grasp over multiple languages, yet will sincerely apologize to me humbly for their accent. There is a strong parallel question for me to grapple with in regards to revising and teaching collective and historical memories and the concept of correctness, straight out of our textbooks or otherwise. Well, I think it is safe to rely on our own sense of integrity, right? In finding some answers to our questions and practicing what we preach, as the old saying goes. So I'm often telling my students to take positive risks in their learning, to expand beyond their comfort zones and to try things that feel a little too hard. It is really our duty, it's our responsibility, and the onus is on us as leaders, teachers, to demonstrate these values in action and create our spaces with as much freedom, flexibility, and trust in each other as possible. Even if and when we will feel a little wobbly, uncertain, or as if we're maybe abandoning some of our old notions. We too often let fear, self-consciousness, or doubt hinder our own abilities to be authentic in our own passions when and where it may be just needed the most. And we need to model, as leaders, teachers, and mentors, creative, passionate expressions for our students, and then use skillful, effortful listening to receive their passionate expressions. So there's much added richness and support to each other, of each other, through cultivating a how to think as opposed to a what to think approach. By practicing positive risk-taking in front of our own students, we become mutually accountable in the often uncomfortable process of growth, change, progress, and human evolution. Now, another mantra I frequently like to use is learning is done by the learner. This is a reminder that there is an onus on the student, the scholar, to welcome, to embrace, and seize these opportunities to learn, grow, change, progress, and evolve. No amount of assigned checklists completed, hoops jumped through, or business of school-oriented tasks can really total the individual experience of actually learning and growing, especially through adversity, which we're all knowing so well. For this reason, it becomes handy to just remember that learning is done by the learner. Now, perhaps a very well-guided, well-taught, well-mentored learner, but by the learner all the same. I hope some of the phraseology that I have been using today and some of the essence of this phraseology, especially with regard to mutual accountability as part of our solution set for hard problems, now feels a little more accessible. So before I hand it over to Molly, I just wanted to share with you some tech-savvy techniques, remote environment, that I've tried this past year to help create space by offering multiple entry points for processing, discussion, and for students to feel seen and heard. And I feel these ideas I'm getting ready to share have been met with positive outcomes. Widgets on Desire to Learn. So for those of us who are active in using Desire to Learn, being able to put widgets such as Flipgrid, which Flipgrid is a collaborative video blogging application, as a widget into your front page of D2L, that was awesome. Same with the application called Remind, which is basically like announcements, group texting, texting from mobile devices straight up on a public widget. And what's called the activity feed in Desire to Learn as well, which is really just like posting, just by posting social media, almost like it would be on Facebook. I've also tried to differentiate my style to become a little bit more like a podcast, a shared podcast, and like a radio program, even with kind of callers, just to give that little extra boost of edutainment, where maybe students go away feeling like they want to tune in next time. I have also tried to reconfigure my classes as a simulation. So simulated scenarios. This really sparks imagination and creativity for metacognitive and critical thinking strategies. Really recommend employing simulations if anybody is game. I've also brought in using children's literature. Now, this one's not tech savvy, but using children's literature, even just right, on camera, to help, of course, gain perspective on whatever it is that the children's literature is connecting to in the adult curriculum, but also help our parents in the class to just kind of gain a cool story for their kids or some connection to help bridge the educational experience. I've begun using Pinterest because Pinterest has a lot more academic credibility, I think, than people sometimes realize through digital collaborative collaging, and it's fun. And then I also have been trying to really leverage the assignment of specific roles to students in the class this year as well. So honors roles, teaching assistantship-like roles, research assistant-like roles. And it helps, I think, with that mutual accountability and onus. Okay, now one final note before we hear from Professor Russell here. I do have a signature acronym to help me organize my own main ideas and philosophies and models, and to help you remember some key words or ideas as well. Now, that acronym corresponds to our resolution for flexibility, to take positive practice risks, and to try new techniques, and it uses the word agile. I hope, in light of attending our presentation today, that you will augment your authentic, guided, immediate, intuitive listening and learning to leverage equitable, engaged experiences and environments. I also hope if you see another or a better word to enhance this agile acronym, that you will let me know a little bit later when we hear from all of you. Now, Molly, of course, none of what I was talking about today is any surprise for you, since you and I have been working on it and you've been helping me construct, deconstruct, and reconstruct these ideas really for quite some time now in our collaborative journal, which I just love. And I'm excited to hear, though, what is on your mind today as well.
Thank you, Brian. I really appreciate you sharing your positive practice risks and the multiple entry points that you use in your classroom. Before I share some of mine, I thought that I would start by sort of localizing what I'm understanding the problem to be and the equity gap to be. Some of this data was shared with me in the same equity training at CCD that Brian also attended and referenced earlier. So community colleges serve 41% of the United States undergraduate population, and they have the unique ability to provide access and economic mobility to low income and minority students. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, in fall of 2017, 44% of Hispanic and 35% of Black undergraduates were enrolled in community college. And I heard earlier in Landon Pirius's talk, he offered that the community college system, we serve 40% students of color and 60% first generation students. So the Colorado Department of Higher Education has identified the equity gap as the difference between an ethnic group's current college degree attainment level compared to CDHE's goal of 66% of students enrolled attaining a post-secondary credential. So you can see on your screen that in Colorado, the post-secondary credential attainment for white students, Latinx students, Black students, and Indigenous students, we can clearly see that there is a significant gap in the educational attainment of white students and racially minoritized students. So to address the equity gap that exists in Colorado, CDHE has committed to increasing the degree attainment of minority and low-income students as part of their master plan. That has been translated and taken up by the Colorado Community College System and my institution, and I'm sure your institutions as well, as part of our strategic missions, plans, and initiatives. So when I was first confronted with all of this data, I was very overwhelmed. I really didn't know how to address this issue in my classroom and in my work. I was also overwhelmed by the complexity of the problem and also how my classroom was no exception to this issue. Further, after being confronted with my class's student achievement data disaggregated by race, ethnicity, and gender, I became even more confounded and overwhelmed. To know that my implicit bias, possible use of microaggressions, or perpetuation of stereotypes or other unintentional or habitual or learned oppressive habits or forms of communication may have impacted my students' achievement was disheartening, humbling, and confusing. Through critical reflection, I came to understand that it was part of my job to do everything I could to address this in my work, to teach a class and create a classroom climate that feels inclusive to all of my students. And I believe, like researchers Liera and Dowd, that in order to accomplish the goal of racial equity, faculty, staff, and administrators must become aware of the racial inequities that exist in the classrooms and programs on campus in order to make the necessary changes to develop a welcoming campus and classroom for all students. And as Kathy Davidson once stated, the classroom is one of the least egalitarian places on the planet. So today I'm going to share how I made sense of addressing the equity gap in my work. And I want you to know that this is an ongoing process and never-ending process for me. And I also want to thank Brian. We've been engaging in a method called collaborative journaling, where we journal together and work with each other to host conversations in a safe space. I can talk more about that later if there are questions around collaborative journaling. So my first major grapple was with control. When we first moved to remote learning a year ago, I initially felt like my students were increasingly wanting me to be the source of information and knowledge so that they were passive learners behind their computer screens. And I want to realize that perhaps this was due to the stress and anxiety around the shift and the pandemic, but the problem still continues to this day. So how could I design a course and promote, as Brian is often known for saying, learning that is done by the learner? Additionally, control manifests itself in the remote classroom through mandates around webcams and monitoring of students' D2L activity. So my big question here was, does the teacher serving as an authoritarian and dumping knowledge into students' heads, does that serve all students? My second grapple was around deadlines. Late policies and point deductions for late work. I grappled with and worked to unpack why I was enforcing rigid deadlines and why I was deducting late points. And I realized I was doing it because A, it's what I had always done. B, it's what my professors did when I was in school. And C, I thought that it seemed like a policy that I was helping my students become better students or better employees. But what I realized is that if I asked my department chair for extra time on a task, they would probably grant it to me. And in my doctorate program, my professors accept late work all of the time. So my two questions intersect in many different ways. So now I'll transition to a brief discussion of how I've changed some of my practices in the classroom to engage in what I believe to be more equity-minded teaching. So I attended a session several weeks ago that was hosted by UConn's Writing Center, and Asao Inouye, he presented at that conference, and I quote him from that conference session, and he stated, "Your standard operating procedure should become unstandard operating procedures." And so I want to discuss how I changed in some of my standard operating procedures to become unstandard. So in regards to control of attendance requirements, of controlling every minute of class, of mandating my students turn on their webcams, of requirements, I let it go. Well, yes, I still maintain the required attendance records. I do not mandate that my students attend my synchronous class sessions to participate in class. I also do not mandate that my students tell me why they need to miss class or self-disclose any information about their participation in class that makes them feel uncomfortable. I do ask that my students read and complete a pre-activity before coming to class. And if they're able to pretend they participate in an in-class portion of the activity, that can also be made up on D2L. Therefore, students are not penalized if they have to miss class for work or family or illness or any other reason or barrier that they find. I make space in my classroom for talking about topics, interest, and things that resonate with my students, even if they're in a sense tangentially related to course content. I teach communication, so it's often kind of easy for me to relate some of those impromptu conversations that erupt that I find to be community building and sort of relate them back to the course content that we're discussing for the day. I also open my class with a daily dedication where I ask students to dedicate our class and our time together they share something or someone that inspires them to work towards their goals in an effort to foster the creation of a supportive classroom community. And it's so fun when they find connections to each other and can support each other if someone discloses something difficult that they're going through. Bell Hooks is quoted in saying, actually in Teaching to Transgress, the book that was referenced in our opening session today, that making a classroom more inclusive creates chaos and confusion. So be patient and attentive. It does get a little crazy in my classroom, and I do have to be, comfortable with being uncomfortable in the fact that I'm not controlling every moment of the class, but it makes it more fun and engaging, and I'm hearing from my students. I also use a lot of breakout rooms. As I can say from experience, if we're thinking about the webcams, I take classes just like this in this format for my doctoral program. And a lot of students won't turn on their webcams in the main room because it feels like they're being, you're sort of in front of the whole class. But once you go into breakout rooms, even in my doctoral program, those webcams will come on and those mics will unmute. And so highly recommend breakout rooms. I do want to say that I don't go into my students' breakout rooms. I don't want them to feel like I'm surveilling them or watching over them, but I use Google Docs to facilitate conversations where I can provide comments on their note-taking on the Google Doc, and we can engage in conversations without my physical presence in the WebEx or the Zoom room. In regards to deadlines, I set deadlines for the course, or excuse me, for students to complete the work by, but they aren't hard deadlines. I'll take late work at any point in the semester with no penalty to a student's grade. I do a once a week check to see who's completed the work by the deadline. And if I see that a student has fallen behind, I'll send them a message via D2L, or I can also text our students through EAB Navigate, which is a new platform that we're using. And ask them if they're okay. Did they understand the requirements for the week? Is there something going on in their life that's presenting a barrier to their contribution to the class? I check on my students first as humans, as full-time students, as full-time family members, and often full-time employees. I want to offer them empathy, grace, understanding, and compassion. I want to validate their experiences, their frustrations, and I want to offer them my support. And I don't necessarily have data to say if this has worked, but I will say anecdotally that I have a wonderful attendance in my classes, and my gradebook is full of grades, and my assignment boxes are full of contributions to the class. Lastly, in this work, I redesigned many of my lessons with a social justice and anti-racist lens. I find ways to connect the course content to issues that impact my students and society at large. When we talk about verbal communication, I host conversations and debates around if hate speech should continue to be protected by our First Amendment constitutional rights. When we talk about culture, we talk about privilege, oppression, race, and racism. When we talk about gender, we discuss how gender stereotypes and operating under traditional gender norms continue to perpetuate inequities. I believe that these conversations can be fostered in any classroom. And I believe that it is our job as educators to serve as, quote from Lear and Dowd again, change agents to racial equity. And I will say that if this is something that you struggle with, that connection to your course content, you can use the classroom experience as a way to foster some of these conversations. So unpacking the power structures at work between the teacher and student relationship is a good place to start, maybe in the first week of class. Additionally, I'd encourage you to reflect on what other policies, procedures, and assessments in your course value dominant ideologies and standards. For example, Brian and I are currently engaging in an exercise to examine an assessment in public speaking. We're doing this inspired by the work of Dr. Vershawn Dr. Vershawn Ashanti Young. He's more commonly known as Dr. Vey. We're engaging in an analysis of a spoken word piece to see how it meets our public speaking standards in order to unpack how other forms of expression could also meet some of our learning outcomes. So I want to leave you with one last piece, and that is around assignments. I want to share some really interesting research by Singer, Freeman, Hobbs, and Robinson in 2019. And they looked at equity in assignments. And what they found were that certain assignments perpetuate inequities in our student achievement. And so these assignments that you can see on your screen, reflective writing, writing in the disciplines, oral projects, and inclusive projects, these are all assignments that their research showed to have high inclusive content and high utility value. So high inclusive content means that it allows students to express the learning in their own words, to feel confident they can succeed, allows them to relate class materials to their own experiences, and includes clear instruction. Additionally, scaffolding was a huge piece of this as well. And also high utility value. These are assignments that work to help students to understand themselves better, improve academic understanding, and provide students with experiences that they perceive to be professionally useful. So lastly, I encourage you to take some time to engage in critical reflection and to unpack and understand the ways in which your course may be perpetuating dominant ideologies or policies that you may have believed, like I did, serve your students, but perhaps work with a deficit perspective rather than an asset-based perspective. And like Dr. Rogers said in our opening session today, what types of things do we need to unlearn to design the types of learning experiences that put racial equity and social justice at the forefront? So thank you. I want to turn it back over to Brian as I change the slide.
Well, Molly, thank you so much. You are just a wealth of perspective and expertise and information and references and research. And just it's such a privilege to just be in your space and just listen to you present to us for just that period of time. So thank you, Molly, so much for all of that. What we'd like to do now, everybody, is open things up to your questions, your comments. What resonates? What are the challenges that you may have for us now that you've listened to our presentation? So we want to open up our microphones and just hear from you. In general, and or like Molly had said, we would love to also hear any of what you guys or you folks are thinking would be your best practices, your best recommendations, things that are working for you in this time and in this space. Anybody can start.
I'll start. My name is Ayelet. I'm from Red Rocks Community College. I wanted to ask about scaling because these are all the ideas. I love them, but I'm trying to think about someone who teaches 5 classes of 35 students each, and it's time consuming. How can you fit it all in your day?
Brian, do you want to talk to that question first?
I really do feel like that was a big chunk of what I was grappling with. And so that's why in the keynote session, in the opening session, when we were chatting a little bit about, is time really, kind of our friend, or like what exactly is the restriction of time? It's a tough one, and one that no one is immune to handle. I don't have a good answer for that question. I feel like just putting in as much extra effort, I guess, as each one of us feels comfortable in doing, to just maximize each instructional minute. I always like to talk about the value of 3 minutes, and make sure that we're just using our time wisely. And I actually adopt that mantra in my own classrooms: use our time wisely. Let's use our time wisely. But I don't have a great answer. Molly, how about you?
I think, and I agree, about the time being a barrier, and also being, something that is challenging. We were talking about, I was in a breakout room in the last session with Paul, and I think Brandon was his name. And we were talking about in the breakout room how it takes so much time to find resources that aren't Western centric, to find examples that aren't Western centric, that provide this Western centric narrative. And so one of the things that we talked about as a solution to that would be I asked my students anonymously, I created either a Padlet. I love Brian's idea of Pinterest. Foster a space where students can post or share what they're reading to, what they're listening to. What kind of materials are they, do they have and can they bring? And then how can we sort of honor? I also remember Courtney, who works at CCD, said that she asks her students, what are you reading? And then she tries to incorporate those things in her class. So surveying students, asking students, and encouraging them to contribute to the sort of knowledge building of this space is one good way to, and then build on that every semester, right? And keeping some of those recommendations every semester. So that would be one strategy that I might recommend.
Definitely, Molly. And even right at the end of my classes, I always say, and if you felt cut short, if this was not enough time, you can still be seen and feel heard on. And then I'll say, like, some of those places like Flipgrid or on Pinterest, or on our activity feed, so on and so forth. Those are great suggestions. Okay, what else is cooking? What else is on everybody's mind?
There is some awesome Molly, stuff in the chat, by the way. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt anybody.
Molly, so I tried not having major due dates, but then people didn't finish the course. So what I did is I kind of separated it into 2 parts, right? So at least get through half the course by this time. I take light work. I don't take off points. Just, have you had problems with people just not, because since you don't, you're being so flexible, they don't finish the course?
So I do have some students. I really like your idea of, I used to use these, like, I call them closing dates, right? That, like, the first half of the course will close at this date. And I've gotten rid of those, to be honest. I haven't had that issue yet these past 2 semesters, because one of the things I guess you would call it, like, intrusive advising, is I try first to D2L message, and then I step it up a scale, and then I go to email, and then I go to EAB Navigate. And so I really try to reach out to students, and I also leverage our advisors as well, because we have wonderful advisors at CCD who also can be of assistance in communicating and reaching out to students. And then you can also see on our EAB Navigate platform, you can see what other classes the students are in. So we've been having conversations with other teachers about, like, hey, is this student working in your class? Like, what's, so that we can try to offer more support, especially in this remote learning environment. So I really try to tell my students that you can't do my class in a week. Like, you can't wait till the end of the semester, that this is a weekly, there's a weekly that I ask that you contribute to the class. And if they fall behind, I completely understand. But I will allow them that space to make up the work.
I have a question. I teach design and painting. Hi, I'm Dawn McFadden, CCD. And I find it very difficult to have a very loose schedule for deadlines because critique is so important. And when people don't, when only half the class would have their work completed, I can't keep going back and forth on critiques for different projects because I have to move forward. So yeah, so I feel like I certainly have opened up and let people turn in things late, or at least show up with part of their work or whatever. But just getting rid of those, I don't. Is there any other person who teaches a visual class that has just given up on critiques, because that has always been important?
Those are great questions, Don. Is there anyone with us today that also teaches a visual art that could speak to that question? Because I know that Brian and I don't have that experience.
Yeah, I teach within, our foundations in photography, digital photography. And so Don and I kind of in the same house, we experienced this, and I've shifted to submission periods. And then, so I've removed due dates and deadlines as a language completely from my courses. And then I advocate and make space for the students to come and speak with me directly at their discretion if they're unable to meet the submission period. So I usually have, let's say, a week submission period for our major creative projects, which would be the target for critique, as Dawn mentioned. And the space of critique for me has become more about um, students sharing their work, sharing what they feel is complete work, and then we can discuss and give constructive feedback about that work. Even sometimes if that critique is partial, and I've had that same experience, Don, where not everybody is ready for that critique day. So now my critiques do span more than one session, right? So I have been able to be more adaptable, or had to be more adaptable in terms of that time frame. And so within a studio art course, we're very, very lucky to have uh, and this is not online, as we're sort of mainly talking about in the session, but certainly we've done this online digitally through COVID, through in digital photo classes, where then there's some time carved out on the Tuesday and that Thursday of the submission period for the critique, or post the submission period, to bring in the next people. And usually what I've found is that if I have constructive, helpful feedback for the folks who are done first, that actually has motivated folks to go ahead and complete it and present in that next session. Not always, but again, it's adaptive. And then you get back to working with those folks individually, and maybe having a separate office hours one-on-one critique for the work that didn't come in time. That's just my 2 cents.
These are such excellent points. Thank you, you guys. Doesn't it make you wish we had every Friday to just do this and just be with one another and share these kinds of ideas? I really wish we had more time, right? Back to that notion of time, but I do see we're getting ready to conclude. And so what did we do today? Well, we were thinking about leveraging passion pursuits, creativity, community, and joyful exploration to increase equity and outcomes, and recognize that is possible in the remote environment if we're willing to be agile, reflective, and willing to take positive practice risks. Our main points included a human rights-based approach to adult learning, teaching for social justice, taking positive practice risks with mutual accountability and shared onus, tried techniques and outcomes such as multiple entry points, a no best way mindset, critical reflection, and teacher vulnerability. We discussed designing major assignments for equity, critical pedagogy, and of course, what's bubbled up from all of you just now, our wonderful participants, and your shared perspectives as your latest and greatest recommendations. We just want to thank you so very much for sharing your best practices in the remote environment. It's been a challenging year for everybody. This is who we are. Thank you for being with us today. This is how you can contact us today, and we'd encourage you to do so. Molly, any last words from you?
I want to thank you all for your time today. I know that I was just flipping through the chat, and there are some wonderful recommendations here, and even some questions that we weren't able to address. So I'll dig through the chat and try to see if I can find emails for those who asked some questions about our presentations, but feel free to email us. We love talking about this stuff. We love collaborating. So thank you so much, Brian. And thank you to Melody, who was our moderator for today, for her wonderful technological assistance as well. So we hope you have a wonderful rest of your Equity Symposium.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Molly.
you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being here
Thank
with us
you.
today.
Bye. Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye,
this was great.
thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.